Before I get to the book, I want to mention some hadith about our current state of affairs. There's a lot of good things in the world, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of excellent things, and there's still a lot of good people. And there's a lot of good to spread, and a lot of improvement to make as well. One should never lose hope, and we can better ourselves. And we sometimes think to ourselves, I look at all these Muslims that came before, how do we can't imitate them, they're all these great. That's not our concern really. تلك الأمة قد خلت, the people have passed away now. We can't. Nobody's asking anybody to be the next Ghazali. That's not our job. Our job is just to be the best of what we can be and fulfill our covenant with God. Often what we get is we get stories, romanticized stories of early Muslims praying 1,000 nafil a night, and that stuff isn't important to us. What's important to us is just to fulfill our obligation with God, whatever that may be. And the Prophet ﷺ made it very simple for us. He didn't complicate it. He didn't tell anybody to pray 1,000 nafil a night. There were people who did that. He just kept things simple. As a messenger of God said, that إِنَّ الْحَلَالَ بَيِّن وَإِنَّ الْحَرَامَ بَيِّن. What's halal is clear, what's haram is clear. What's between the two are doubtful matters, and stay away from it. Very simple advice he gave. Don't trouble people with much. Pray your prayers. Send prayers upon me, salutations upon the messenger of God. Read the Quran and be a witness. Don't make it mahjur. Don't leave it abandoned on the day of judgment to witness against you. Be good to your neighbors. These simple universals. Islam is not a complicated religion in that sense. It's very easy to do. And it needs more niyyah and ikhlas than it does action. Often in the hadith that Shaykh Salih Farfur mentions in his commentary of the Arba'un, that niyatul mar'i khayrun min amalihi, the intention of a person is better than his action. So the state we're in, however, with knowledge is really bad. It's not good at all. Scholars are dying all the time. Just in this last year, we've lost great scholars. Sheikh Ali Sabuni originally from Aleppo, passed away. He's been in Istanbul for a very long time. Dr. Nuruddin Aitar, the greatest hadith scholar who was alive, passed away, rahimahullah. The last really high-grade surviving student he was at that time of Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin, who was the greatest hadith scholar of his era, who was a man that his books were accepted by the Prophet ﷺ in his dreams. These scholars slowly disappear. Mawtul alim, death of a scholar is the death of a nation. I want to mention why this is so problematic. There are hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talk about this. إِنَّ مِنْ أَشْرَاطِ السَّاعَةِ أَنْ يُرْفَعَ الْعِلْمُ وَيَثْبُتُ الْجَهْلُ وَيُشْرَبُ الْخَمْرُ وَيَظْهَرُ الزِّنَا. The Prophet ﷺ said the day of judgment will not come until the following things happen. يُرْفَعَ الْعِلْمُ, knowledge will be raised. And I'll talk about those hadith that mention how it will be raised. وَيَثْبُتُ الْجَهْلُ, ignorance will be a common place. That's يَثْبُتُ الْجَهْلُ means that ignorance will be firmly established. You can just check anybody's WhatsApp messages for that. And the stuff that you get, like that they don't verify most of the time. Aside from that, you can see the types of people that are masquerading on YouTube as representatives of Islam, having done a few weekend courses, and the irony is that they're sitting as the new Imam Tirmidhi, and they probably haven't studied Arabic for more than 6 to 8 months. And it's terrible. I mean, it's horrific, but it is one of the signs. وَيُشْرَبُ الْخَمَرُ, and alcohol will be consumed en masse. وَيَظْهَرُ الزِّنَا. The zina thing really, I didn't understand it. I paid a lot of attention to it. But what does يَظْهَرُ zina mean? Zina will be apparent. How can zina be apparent, you see? You can say widespread, but that's not what the hadith states, you see. I think this hadith is in reference to pornography. وَيَظْهَرُ zina. Zina will be dhahir. You could see it, it's apparent, it's clear. Because even now, nobody sees zina. You know that it's happening, but you do through that medium. The Prophet ﷺ said also, يَتَقَارَبُ الزَّمَانُ وَيَنْقُصُ الْعَمَلُ. The time will come close and action will disappear. It will lessen people's what it means by action here is this kind of prophetic paradigm of action. وَيُلْقِ الشُّحْ وَتَظْهَرُ الْفِتَنُ, and fitan will be everywhere. وَيَكْثَرُ الْهَرْجُ. This is really important point, especially in London. It's worse than Birmingham, it's worse here than in Birmingham. Let's say like all these kids killing one another. There's a hadith about that. But the Prophet ﷺ said in almost Every hadith that mentions removal of knowledge is followed up by this statement, وَيَكْثُرُ الْهَرْجُ. Sahaba didn't know what this word meant. What do you mean harj will be everywhere? He said, al-qatlu, al-qatlu. Killing will be everywhere. They said to him, what do you mean by killing, Ya Rasulullah? Is it like when we fight in war? He said, no. He said, a neighbor will kill a neighbor. Uncle will kill his nephew. Nephew will kill his uncle. A brother will kill his brother. And they said, Aina ukuluhum that al-yawm. Where are their senses? He said, they have none. For one will do that, and you will ask him after why he did it, and he'll say, I don't know. If that's not what we're living in, I mean, they just don't know why they're doing it, you see. And it always comes with the disappearance of knowledge. Constantly they're connected, you see. Then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in another hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَقْبِضُ الْعِلْمَ انتزاعا ينتزعه من العباد. God will not take knowledge by tearing it away from the people. He will just lift it in that way, like wipe the data away, you know. وَلَكِنْ يَقْبِضُ الْعِلْمَ بِقَبْضِ الْعُلَمَةِ. But he will take scholars one by one. حَتَّى إِذَا لَمْ يُبْقِ عَالِمًا اتَّخَذَ النَّاسُ رُؤُوسٌ جُهَالًا. Until no scholars are left and people take as their leaders ignorant people. فَسُئِلُوا, they ask questions. فَأَفْتَوْا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ, they give fatwas sitting on their swirling chairs on their YouTube channels. بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ, that's not in the hadith, of course. بِغَيْرِ, with no knowledge. فَضَلُّوا وَأَضَلُّوا, they misguided and they misguide others. 50,000 hits, 75,000 hits. And you've got one poor scholar, Shaykh Salih Ghursi, one of the leading scholars of this time. But 200 people will watch his video in Arabic or whatever it may be, and sitting in Konya somewhere. Nobody appreciates that unless it's exciting. I was saying earlier to some of the students that the end of time signs are just entertainment now. That's why everybody just wants to be entertained. You know, when's Dajjal coming? Like Abu Hurayra, do you know that Abu Hurayra made a dua? He said, oh Allah, give me death. He said, Aqbid ruhi. And they said to him, you're a companion of the Messenger of God and you want to die. Like, why would you make that dua for? Why would you ask for death? He said, the Messenger of God said, when Dajjal comes, the first thing we'll take from people is the iman. And I make this dua so he takes me before the Dajjal comes. Everybody wants to know when he's going to turn up. The Abu Hurayra, Sahabi and Jalil, wants to be taken away before seeing that period. So unfortunately, that's the time we live in. Slowly these things are the fabric of our tradition is being removed. And that's why it's important sometimes to read about these narrations about the Prophet ﷺ and kind of at least re-establish a core kind of connection to him as a person, as a loving connection. Unfortunately, and I want to mention this, depends what era you grew up in. It depends, but this is some advice to parents generally. Parents often, they damage the relationship of their children with God and His Messenger ﷺ. What that means is when they're growing up, they use God as a tool of punishment almost. If you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. If you don't do this, God's going to be upset with you. The Messenger of God will not look at you on the Day of Judgment. You're not following. You don't bring your kids up in that way. Ever. Wallahi, don't do that. God should not be mentioned in any discourse when you're disciplining your children. You want to discipline your child. You don't need to invoke God. A naughty step will do. Taking the PlayStation away will do. You don't need to bring God into the discourse. Because that child will grow up thinking of God in a very negative way. And I've had to cancel people out of this type of trauma. And they'll think of God negatively constantly, and they'll get to a point in their lives where they don't want to think of God because their waswasas, their whisperings will just overpower them because they'll think bad things, you see. That's not the way to bring up children. We should only invoke God for love. You know, invoke God to build a positive relationship in our children, a rewarding relationship. You know, the great scholar Ibn Jawzi talked about how you should pay children, give them money when they memorize Quran. Like, give them gifts. We give gifts for everything else. Your son or daughter come back with 10 A stars or whatever it is for GCSE. I don't know how they're grading it now. And, you buy them whatever, open arms. But, if they just memorize just a little bit, just reward them. Build that relationship with them. The Prophet ﷺ rewarded children all the time. He never rebuked children in that way. You never find a child in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, except he grows up to love him. Do you know that what the ages of the Sahaba were? Zayd ibn Arqam, do you know his age? Zayd ibn Arqam. Dar Arqam, the house that the Prophet ﷺ was praying, he was 16 years old. Abdullah ibn Abbas, 9, 10. Sayyidina Ali around the same age. Abdullah bin Umar, very young in his teenage years. Sayyidina Umar was only in his 20s. All the Sahaba in that period, no, most of them in that period were teenagers. Abdullah bin Mas'ud, they were very, very young. And if you think about them, you think about them as old people. But they're not, they weren't. They were very, very young. Abdullah ibn Abbas was 10 years old when the Prophet ﷺ said to him, "Ihfadillah yahfadka," be aware of God and God will protect you. That's what he said to him at the age of 10 or 11, a young child. He said to him, if you're going to ask anybody, ask God. If you're going to seek aid, seek it from God. He said, if the entire world were to gather to harm you, they will not be able to do so unless God willed it. And if they were to gather to bring you benefit, they will not be able to do so unless God willed it. The pens have been lifted, the ink is dry. That's to a 10-year-old child he's talking to, the Messenger of God. It shows their kind of maturity, and he knew they were ready to receive that kind of advice from him.